guys, and welcome back to another Mystery Monday video on my channel. As you can see, I got a little bit of a new background. This also probably isn't permanent. I'm probably going to be changing this up a lot as I settle into filming here. This picture is actually the one that came in the frame, so that's definitely going to be changing soon. I just didn't know what to put in it as of right now, so once I figure that out, that picture will be different. But today I am back with another true crime case, and throughout the video it might not seem like a Mystery Monday, but at the end of the video it will reveal why I chose to do this as a Mystery Monday video instead of a Freaky Friday video. Anyways, on top of that, today's video is a serial killer case, and I feel like I'm a little bit unpracticed in these kinds of cases. I just never know how to present them or cover them, but I'm doing my best. So with that all being said, I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video, and let's get right into it. This is me coming on here a little bit later after I started to edit this video. I do just want to give a disclaimer at the very beginning of this video that this case is absolutely horrible, and it does include a lot of sexual assault, so if those kinds of things trigger you, please do not watch this video. Maybe go check out one of the other videos on my channel, because this case is just a very, very heavy one, and I want you to be prepared for that going into this case. So today we are going to be talking about Albert Delsavo, also known as the Boston Strangler. I was going to cover this case, or I was thinking of covering this case for quite a while, but again, I never know how to present serial killer cases, and then one of you guys requested this video, and I thought that this was the perfect opportunity to cover this case. Albert Delsavo, unlike other serial killers, is speculated to have not been responsible for the murder of the 13 women that he was being accused of murdering. And so today we're going to be kind of exploring both sides of this case. So Albert was born in 1931, and he lived in a small little area on the outskirts of Boston, and the area that he lived in was kind of run down and not very nice. His family never had a lot of money. Albert had 5 siblings, and he lived with his mother and father. And just like a lot of other serial killers, Albert did not have the best childhood. In fact, his childhood was absolutely awful, and this was due to his father. His father was just a really, really horrible man. He abused all 6 of his children. He abused his wife, on one occasion even breaking all of his wife's fingers in front of his kids. He would bring home sex workers on a regular basis and beat them in front of his children. He would beat the children. He forced Albert into sex at the age of 7. He started to introduce the kids to like petty crime. He was in jail a lot, and he started to introduce his kids how to kind of get away with petty crime at a very, very young age. His childhood was just absolutely awful. There are interviews that you can find online of some of his other siblings talking about just how awful the abuse from his father was, just confirming that it was that bad. But despite having this bad of a childhood and just things not being that great, Albert was said by teachers to be a pretty polite, personable kid. They said he was definitely troubled, and he definitely caused some issues in the classroom and at school, but nothing too out of the ordinary. He was really polite, he was very helpful, and again, just very, very personable. That was until 1943, when Albert and one of his friends decided to try and hold up a cleaners. Now, they were very, very young, and they got caught, and they did this using a fake gun, and so Albert was sent to Lyman School for Boys, which is like a reform school, and after going there, it was said that he wasn't really the same. At reform school, a lot of people say because the boys that are sent there are already bad, they're already labeled as bad boys, they kind of pick on one another, and the only way to really defend yourself is to kind of seem like the bigger, badder of the group. So Albert started to kind of portray himself like that. And then in 1948, at the age of 17, Albert decided to join the army. And a lot of people who knew Albert said that this seemed like a really, really good fit for him. This is finally a place where he seemed like he truly fit in and was doing something that he was good at. Now, another thing to note here, and for lack of a better word, I'm going to use the word obsessed. Albert was absolutely obsessed with sex. While in Germany only, it is said that he had sexual encounters with over 2,000 women. Now, not all of these women were consenting to what was done to them, but 2,000 women, and on top of that, he was said to have been pleasuring himself multiple times a day. On one of the trips while returning to the States, Albert was in New Jersey when he was accused of sexually assaulting a 9-year-old girl. He did this by posing as a handyman who was entering her home to do some work for the family. Now, Albert completely denied these allegations. He pled not guilty, but eventually the case was actually dropped because the mother of the daughter did not want the daughter to have to testify and go through the trauma of reliving what had happened to her. So Albert was never charged with this, and this case was just ultimately completely dismissed. So while in Germany, Alfred had met a woman and they fell in love and they got married. So now at this point, Alfred and his wife were moving back to Boston, and they were planning on just living a crime-free life. They were planning on having children, but Alfred obviously had some issues and he fell back into the lower end community and to crime. But again, something that I just want to re-mention is anybody who came into contact with Alfred said that he seemed like a really nice guy. He was generally really liked, and he was quite a people person, which is something that is stated about a lot of serial killers that might just freak you out a little bit more. So at this time, he had already been returned to Boston for quite a while, and that is when he fell back into crime and he started to perform breaking and entering. Now again, I don't want to use the word good, but I don't know what other word to use here. Albert was said to be very, very good at breaking into people's homes and gaining access to apartments. And something that I just was thinking while I was writing this down and taking notes on this case is he was taught how to break into homes at a very young age. So like some of us who maybe danced or played soccer or who did art, you end up perfecting those kinds of things over the span of a few years, and Albert again was taught how to break into homes at a very young age, so he had a lot of time to perfect that, and that is probably why he was said to be so good at gaining access to these homes. But despite being very good at gaining access to these people's homes, Albert would find himself serving a lot of time in jail for these breaking and enterings. At one point though, after this, Albert just wasn't satisfied and he started going door to door pretending that he worked for a modeling agency. When a woman would open the door and he found her attractive, he would tell her that the model agency that he was working for was looking for new models, and he would give her a description of exactly what she looked like. He would tell her she was perfect for the job, and all that he needed was to take her measurements. He would get these women to invite him into their home, and then he would get them to strip down so that he could take these measurements, and at some point during this process, he would start to try to seduce them. And some of these women did comply. They consented to having sexual encounters with Albert, but many of them didn't, and after these encounters that were not consented to, the police started to receive a lot of phone calls about this man coming to their house who was a model, who worked for a modeling agency, and trying to take their measurements, and that is when the police dubbed this person the Measuring Man. Now, a little while after this all happened, Albert was brought in because he was caught breaking into somebody's house. At this point, he confessed to being the Measuring Man, and he was sent through a kind of psych evaluation, and that is when he was diagnosed as being a psychopath and was put in jail for only 11 months. Albert was finished his 11-month sentence in 1962, and that is when things would start to take an even darker twist in this case. The body of a murdered woman was found on June 14th, 1962. This was the body of 56-year-old Anna Sletzer. Her body was discovered in her third-floor apartment on Gainsbury Street, and she had been sexually assaulted by an unknown object and had been strangled with the, the thing that ties up your house coat, and it was tied still around her neck in a bow. And this would be just the start of a series of murders that would strike Boston by complete storm. Another one of these victims was 85-year-old Mary Mullen. Her body was discovered on June 28th, 1962 in her apartment. She had died due to a heart attack, and I will talk a little bit more about this case later on because I do want to address how she had died from a heart attack and how her case was linked to the rest of them. Nina Nichols, who was 68 years old, would be the next of these victims. Her body was discovered on June 30th, 1962 in her home in Boston. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her nylon stockings, which again were left in a bow tied around her neck. That exact same day, the body of 65-year-old Helen Blake would also be discovered. Her body again was discovered in her home in Lynn, Massachusetts, and she had been sexually assaulted and also strangled with a nylon stocking. Again, the person who was responsible for these murders left each woman with what appeared to be a decorative bow tied around their neck after they had strangled them with whatever was used to tie the bow. In the first case, that would be the string that ties up her housecoat, and in the last two cases, that would have been the nylon stockings. That pretty much painted a clear picture to investigators that all of these cases were in fact connected. The next body was discovered on August 19th, 1962. This would be the body of 75-year-old Ida Urga. Her body was discovered in her apartment in Beacon Hill, Boston, and she, just like the other women, had been sexually assaulted and strangled, but this time she was strangled using a pillowcase. By this time, this was happening so frequently that this had all of Boston in an absolute uproar. All of the elderly women who lived in the Boston area were absolutely terrified. They were all trying to up their security. Everybody was just so scared because it seemed like this person was gaining access to these women's homes in ways where it didn't appear to police like they were causing any kind of like unwanted entry. Like there was no forced entry found at any of the scenes. So these women must have trusted whoever was doing this to them enough to have let them into their home, which is just a terrifying thought. On August 21st, 1962, the decomposing body of 67-year-old Jane Sullivan was discovered in her apartment. Her home was in Dorchester, Boston, and she had been strangled with her own stocking and again sexually assaulted. So up until this point, again, it had only been elderly women who had fallen victim to this murderer. And due to the short span of time that this was happening, police really began to bust down on this case because, again, it appeared as if these women were willingly letting their murderer into their home. Police interviewed over 100 different men in this case. They never really had any solid suspects, but Albert Delsavo was never even on their radar for these murders. And in December of 1962, the serial killer would change his pattern. That is when the body of 20-year-old Sophie Clark was discovered in her Fenway apartment. She, just like the other victims, had been sexually assaulted and strangled using her own stockings, which were left in a decorative bow tied around her neck. The reason that this appeared so strange to investigators was not only because Sophia was much younger than the other victims in this case. Again, Sophie was only 20 years old, whereas the other victims in this case were elderly women, but Sophie was also of not Caucasian descent, which seemed to be another reoccurring thing in this serial killer's pick of victims. Then, on December 31st, 1962, the body of 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was found in her Fenway apartment. She, just like the other victims, had been sexually assaulted and strangled using her own stockings. Months had passed without any other murders taking place until March 6, 1963, when the body of Mary Ann Brown, who was 69 years old, was found raped, beaten, strangled, and stabbed in her apartment in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And then on May 6th of 1963, Beverly Sawman, who had just turned 23-year-old 9 days earlier, did not show up to choir practice. This really worried a lot of her friends because this was very out of character for Beverly. It worried one of her friends so much that he showed up to her home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just to check on her. When she wasn't answering the door, he kind of like wiggled it a little bit and gained access to her home by himself, and that is when he found her body laying on the floor. She, just like the other victims, had been sexually assaulted, and she had 2 handkerchiefs tied tightly around her neck, which were used to strangle. Something else to add to this case that made it a little bit different than the earlier on victims of this serial killer is that Beverly had also been stabbed several times. Next body that was discovered on September 8th, 1963 in Salem was the body of 58-year-old Mary Corbin. She had been raped and strangled with her nylons in her own home. The next body was 22-year-old Joanne Graff, found on November 23rd, 1967. She had been strangled with her nylon stockings and was discovered in her home in Lawrence, Massachusetts. The last body was Mary Sullivan, who was 19 years old and found on January 4th, 1964, in her Boston apartment. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her nylon stockings. Mary had been discovered by her roommates when they returned home, horrified to find Mary dead, sitting upright in her room, in her bed, with a broom shoved up her genital area. And after Mary's death, that is when these murders just abruptly stopped. They didn't find out who it was, and this left a lot of people wondering why. Why did this serial killer stop so abruptly? Had he passed away? Had he moved away? Had he been in jail? What had happened to cause this person to stop committing these horrendous crimes? But with these murders stopping so abruptly, police found themselves having to focus their attention elsewhere because many women started to come forward at this time claiming that they had been sexually assaulted and or raped in their own home by a man who was posing as a handyman. The man was always reported to have been wearing green, and he would tie up his victims, and for this particular reason, he was dubbed the Green Man. And then in 1964, a sketch was done of the Green Man, and this sketch looked strikingly similar to the sketch that had been done of the Measuring Man, which confirmed to investigators that the Measuring Man and the Green Man were the same person, and that was Albert Delsavo. Next little bit of information that I'm going to share with you guys really confused me, and I'm hoping that if I read it directly from what my notes say, which is directly what I got from online, it'll make sense to you guys. It kind of made sense to me, but it just left me with a lot of questions, which I will go into after I read what exactly I got offline. So I'm going to be looking down here just for a minute while I relay this little bit of information to you. So on October 27th, 1964, a man had entered the home of a young woman, pretending to be a detective. He tied this woman up to her bed and sexually assaulted her, and then apologized for doing so by saying, "I am sorry." The woman later would identify her attacker as Albert. At this time, his photo was published with several other women coming forward saying that Albert had sexually assaulted them as well. And this is the part that confused me. So a little bit earlier, on October 27th, 1964, Albert was posing, I guess, as someone having car trouble. And he went to the home of a future police sheriff, and the police sheriff was suspicious of what was going on, and he fired a gun at Albert. I thought that this was interesting and what I wanted to include, but I couldn't find if he was hurt or not, which is what really confused me, because how did he go to this man's house, pose as if he was somebody having car trouble, get shot at by the sheriff, then proceed to go to this woman's house and sexually assault her? Also, he was preying on women, and women who usually lived alone, so why was he trying to gain access to this sheriff's home, or why was he even at the sheriff's house? It just really confused me and left me thinking what the heck? So because so many people were able to identify Albert as the rapist, he was put in jail, and at this time is when he confessed to another inmate about being responsible for the strangulations and the murders of those other 13 women. After this fellow inmate went and confessed what Albert had told him to his attorney, and this attorney would actually later on end up defending Albert. So in Albert's original confession, there were some inconsistencies, but he knew a lot of big details about some of the cases that wouldn't have been known by anybody who hadn't been at the scene. There was no physical evidence to connect Albert to absolutely any of these cases, so they ended up having to try him on separate charges, which would be the rape charges as well as the breaking and entering charges. Albert and his defense attorney tried for the not guilty due to insanity plea, but the judge ruled this as inadmissible. Albert was sentenced to life in prison in 1967, and that same year he would escape, but he would give himself up the following day after he had escaped, and that is when he was put into a maximum security prison where he would remain for the rest of his sentence until he was murdered 6 years later. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the theory or the rumors or speculation that maybe Albert was not responsible for all of these 13 murders, or that maybe he was not the only person responsible for all of these 13 murders. So like I mentioned earlier, there was no physical evidence connecting Albert to any of these cases. The only thing that they had to go on was his confession. Because they had no physical evidence and only his confession, this left a lot of room for doubt, especially by people who had personally known Albert. Something else that left a lot of room for doubt for many people is people assume that serial killers have one specific type of victim, whereas the women who Albert was being charged with the murder of seemed to have been kind of all over the place. At first they were elderly women, then they started to put younger women in the mix. They just didn't seem all to be like the same type of age group or anything like that. But that isn't necessarily true. A lot of serial killers kind of switch up their victims, they switch up their motive, their method, things like that, meaning that this could very well have all been the same serial killer, despite what people may think. In 1968, a very intelligent doctor from Bridgewater Hospital came forward saying that he did not believe that Albert was responsible for this murder at all, and that Albert was just mentally ill and craving some kind of recognition. Many other very intelligent people came forward backing up this doctor's claims, some of them even saying that they had overheard Albert being coerced into a confession. There was a lot of back and forth at this point between people who believed that Alfred was the Boston Strangler and people who believed that Alfred could not be capable for these murders. Even an FBI profiler whose job is to identify people like this came forward claiming that he didn't have any reason to believe that Albert could ever be responsible for something like this. I think the reason that so many people doubt that Alfred could have been responsible or could have been the Boston Strangler, and this is going to sound so weird because he was a very bad man, he was a rapist, but even during these rapes, a lot of the women who were sexually assaulted by Alfred came forward saying that he was very, very gentle during the assault. He always apologized to the victims. On one occasion, one of the women who he had tied up was saying how she was scared that after he left, she wouldn't have been able to get out of the ties, and that she lived alone and she was just absolutely horrified. So Alfred had actually went back and kind of loosened what he had tied her up with so that after he left, she could get out of the ties. And although he was a very, very bad man, because he did these things to kind of show that he had compassion, it made it very difficult for people to process the fact that he could have been a murderer. Theory came to light in the 2000s, I believe, where people started to kind of speculate maybe Alfred didn't work alone and that there was more than one killer responsible for the murder of these 13 women, but that they were all kind of linked and they were talking to each other and kind of in cahoots with one another. But that theory got dismissed pretty quickly and it wasn't really highly believed for a very long time. Then another theory came along, and this theory was that maybe all of the murders hadn't been done by one person, and that maybe Alfred had been responsible for some of these murders, but that there was almost like a copycat killer who was kind of stealing his method and doing the same thing. But that theory also got dismissed, although it did hold on for quite a while. A lot of people really believed that there was more than one killer who were responsible for these deaths and that they hadn't all been connected, but that they had kind of been copying one another. This came from the theory that a lot of people believed that the killer who was responsible for the other 12 murders couldn't possibly have been responsible for the murder of Mary Sullivan. In July of 2013, police found a DNA match from the evidence that they pulled from Mary Sullivan's crime scene, and it was a link to Albert Delsavo, confirming to pretty much everybody that Albert Delsavo was in fact responsible for all of these 13 murders. My heart sincerely goes out to absolutely anybody who had fallen victim to Albert Delsavo, whether it be the 13 women whose lives he took, to all of the thousands of women who he sexually assaulted and took away their dignity. My heart just sincerely goes out to absolutely everybody, and this case is just one that is so sickening, and it really takes a toll on you to think that this man could have brought in so much horror and terror into the world. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. But guys, that brings us to the end of this video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!